Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, feel free to take, my wife spent 2 days collecting those, and I don't want to go home with them. She's not going to be happy. So feel free to take whatever. My name is Mark Musone. I'm the CTO of DataSure24. We're a cybersecurity company. A little bit about me. I've been doing cybersecurity for probably around 22, 25 years or so, working for federal agencies and on behalf of federal agencies for a lot of that time. Either I'm going in there like assessing federal agencies or working on behalf of federal agencies, assessing their contractors and subcontractors and whatnot. That was like half of me, and the other half of me is working for normal commercial companies and helping them with their cybersecurity. So I've kind of seen a whole lot. I've seen the whole gamut. And recently, actually, we were doing forensics for an organization that got a compromise, no surprise. And we ran across some interesting things that I felt would be a good learning experience. And as I had my junior analysts helping, I said, you know what, we can actually make something out of this. I can actually bring this to light to a lot of you. Now, this is not a technical talk. Believe it or not. We're diving deep into malware, but this actually is not a technical talk. In fact, I had our accountant join one of these, and she got it like that. So, and we'll talk more about that later. I think understanding this stuff is going to help other people. If anybody gets a compromise or malware, it's going to kind of help talk you off that edge of the cliff type of thing, and it also may even help prevent malware if you see something like this. So I'll dive into it now. So again, we went in there doing forensics on this compromised system. And one of the things that we had seen was a registry key, a registry entry that wasn't quite in a normal place. It frankly looked suspicious. So we saw the suspicious registry key. Not in a normal place. It has a weird name. For those of you that, I'm not sure if you can see it, the name was like Codoclade or something like that. Again, the whole thing looked pretty wonky. And then looking in more detail to the actual content, the value of that registry key, I had one of my junior analysts, I asked her, what does this look like, or what does she think of this? And she said, well, it looks like gobbledygook, which is kind of pretty right on. It kind of does look like gobbledygook. So before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about, I'm from Buffalo, New York. Anyone from Buffalo representing? Anyone? All right. Just right down the road. And me and my wife, we live fairly close to the lake. We're at Lake Erie. What lake is here in Rochester? Ontario, yeah. All right. So we're in Lake Erie, and right down the road, we pretty much, we have the lake. And every now and then, me and my wife will go to this beach, and we actually call it Fossil Beach. Now, we make up names for everything. That's not its real name. I don't know what its name is. We call it Fossil Beach. We call it Fossil Beach because, well, there's lots of fossils there. So we'll go there and we'll go and collect fossils. And we get a bunch of different types of fossils. These are fossils that we get. Again, we're not fossil people. We're not fossil experts. We just go to the beach and collect some stuff on the ground. And so we give our own names. This little round guy here, we call that brain coral. I don't know, it looks like a brain to us. And then we have what we call horn coral, these pointy little guys. That's what we call horn coral. Again, we have no idea what the real name is. And then we have these like clam-looking things. I don't know, we just call them fossils. But these are pretty much the types of fossils that we see and we collect. And it's interesting because occasionally we'll get our nieces or nephews or some kids from friends of ours that come with us and we say, hey, let's go collect fossils. And they come with us on the beach. And they'll be on the beach, and inevitably 10 minutes later, they run to us and say, Aunt Jen, Aunt Mark, you don't know what you're talking about. There's not a single fossil on this beach. And it's really interesting because me and my wife, we could literally be walking along the beach, not on our hands and knees, not sifting through stuff. We can just be strolling along the beach, looking down. And we could be here and saying, oh, there's a brain coral right there. Oh, there's a horn coral right there. There's another brain coral. There's another fossil, regular fossil right there. Just by looking down, not doing anything fancy. Those fossils that were in the back took my wife 2 hours to collect all of them. That's how quickly and easily we're able to do it. Just boom, boom, boom as we're walking down. The reason why is we're very familiar with what they look like. We've seen it before. It's kind of clicked with us, the texture, the overall look, the colors of them, and kind of what they look like when they're in the ground in contrast to the rest of the rocks. Again, we're not fossil experts, but we're just so used to it, and it's so common to us, we're able to see it like clockwork. So let's go back to our malware here. So this is that same exact registry key. Again, looks like gobbledygook. Now, I am not expecting anyone here to be a programmer or an expert programmer. Anyone here do coding ever? Anyone? I'm kind of hoping maybe people have taken a computer programming course sometime in their life. That's pretty much like the lowest bar of what I'm going to be talking about here. So I don't want to scare anybody away. Now, when it comes to programming languages, there are a few aspects of programming languages that no matter how good that malware is, that malware author can't get around. Most programming languages have things called keywords or reserved words. For those of you that have done coding before or whatnot, a keyword or reserved word is something in the programming language you cannot change the name of it. Normally, you can have a variable, whatever name you want, but you can't have one that's a reserved word. There's also other unique aspects to programming languages, like semicolons. Most people that have programmed before are pretty used to, you normally have a semicolon on the end of a statement and you do a new line. So if we're looking here, right now it looks like gobbledygook. If we start taking a look and we apply simply those two things, you can see, wait a minute, function, for, you can see some remnants of a programming language, right? For, else, if, while, we can see those semicolons. So what I did was, this right here, all I did is wherever there is a semicolon, I simply put a carriage return. It's the same exact code as this. Same exact text, all I did was put a carriage return. So it's still a little difficult to read, but it's kind of looking a little bit more, I don't know, programming. One of the things that, when you took a look at that registry key at first, a lot of times analysts or forensic people, they're gonna look at that and they're gonna either ignore it and say, this is a bunch of gibberish, it's nothing. Or they're gonna say, whoa, above my head, and they're gonna kind of subconsciously stick their head in the sand and just move on because they don't want to deal with it. So again, this is that same exact text, except I'm simply putting a carriage return. And again, it looks code-y. So one thing I want to talk a little bit about is obfuscation. Now, the definition here is obfuscate is to make something less clear and harder to understand, especially intentionally. Now, malware is a technical thing. I don't want to fool anybody. However, obfuscating the malware, that's a human thing. It's somebody trying to exploit weaknesses and gaps in the human mind. So today we're talking about obfuscated malware. Obfuscated malware is trying to confuse people. Again, malware itself is a technical thing. I've been in the trenches of the actual malware. It's assembly code. I've been working on it for months, and my head is still spinning over it. The real technical stuff, the actual payload stuff. But obfuscating the malware, again, that's a human thing. It's the bad guys trying to exploit weaknesses and gaps in the human mind to make it difficult for humans to understand. Now, the interesting thing is computers, they understand obfuscated code. If you have a variable, most of us will make a variable $X or something like that, right? Or $index. But To a computer, it doesn't matter. It doesn't care if that variable is X or some big, long gibberish. A computer is going to understand it equally. So computers understand obfuscated code. But again, it's the humans that have the problem with the obfuscation. So this is that same screen I talked about before with the code that simply has a whole bunch of carriage returns. Now, is there anything here that may kind of stick out based on what I talked about before? Some of you that may have done coding, I know it's a little hard to see, I apologize. I actually did make the font even bigger. So going back to that keywords thing, up here on top it says function Tessel 869. That's interesting, right? We have a block of code. Now a function is pretty much a block of code that does something. So in here, it's kind of interesting. We've can now see there's some block of code that's supposed to be doing something. I have no idea what it does. But typically, if you have a function, you're going to pass some data to that function. The function is going to do something, and then pretty much return in one way or another the result of whatever it did. So based on the fact that we have this function called Tessel 869, anything else stick out at all? Kind of low-hanging fruit here. Again, I apologize, it's hard to see. Well, if we know that this function is this block of code that is going to be called and it's going to be passed in information, we can actually see here, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of places in here that is calling that Tessel 869. So there are a lot of references to Tessel 869. Again, I have no idea what this function does, but I know it's doing something. It's doing something important enough that it's being called a whole lot of times. So what can we do next? So for example here, there's this one variable called $Turokers equals Tessel 869 and passing in a whole bunch of this gobbledygook. You'll be hearing gobbledygook a lot. I apologize. So now what can we do? We have this function, and then we're calling this function a whole bunch of times. Well, we could run the code. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not nuts. I mean, this is malware, and it's actually bad malware, I can tell you. But maybe we can make it so I'm not running the code, but I really don't care if someone else is running the code. So there are websites. This is one. I literally just came across this. I'm not necessarily advocating, but there are websites that allow you to kind of do programming on their website. So you can, whether it's Perl or Python, or in this case, PowerShell. This script is PowerShell. You can literally just type in some code, and you click a run button, and that website will run the code. So I'll let them run the malware and not me. So what I did is, and this particular website is TIO, Try It Online, I guess, and it's got like hundreds of programming languages. So all I did is I went to this website and I literally pasted this Tessel 869 code into the website. Again, we know it's doing something. And then what did I do? I pasted the first actual call to that Tessel 869. Turokers equals Tessel 869 gobbledygook. And then all I did was print out to the screen, okay, what did Tessel 869 do? What was the result? What was the output of it? And this is what I got. It says http://194.5. Well, that's interesting. That kind of looks normal-ish, kind of human. Very interesting. It looks like a URL. So now, let's go and, I don't know, let's go wild. Let's go paste some more of those lines of code in here. So, it seems to be doing some sort of conversion. So we'll paste in the next few lines. It's counterplot 01 equals Tessel 869 ISEEX Stevigsnidber, and I apologize. I actually do try pronouncing this stuff. I don't know. It keeps me sane or something. Stevigsnidber equals Tessel 869 of all this. And let's go print out the result. We're going wild here today. So we have that original URL, Tessel 869 returned. We have this IEX, don't know what that is, but it's something. And then it also returns this syswow64 Windows PowerShell v1.0 / PowerShell.exe. Well, that's interesting. That's not just gibberish. I mean, that must mean something. So now we know that Tessel 869, we're giving it gobbledygook, and it's doing something, some conversion, some translation, and returning something human-y, something normal. So what we could potentially do is, in here, in this code, again, these were the first three that I put in. Instead of having Tarokers equal Tessel 869 gobbledygook, we can just paste in the results of what Tessel 869 does. Does that make sense? Everyone still following me so far? All right. It's a little bit easier to read, right? So all I did was set Tarokers directly to the result of that Tessel 869 gobbledygook. So the next thing, oh, hold on. All right, no, I'll get to that in a sec. All right, so that's what we did so far. The other thing to understand when we're talking about obfuscation is words have meanings. Going back to that obfuscation piece, the bad guys are simply trying to exploit weaknesses in the human mind in order to make things confusing. Anyone know multiple languages? Not programming languages. English, human languages, I guess they're called, right? Anyone? Multilingual? Not many, a couple of you? There is a reason why, for so many people, it's very hard to learn a foreign language. Foreign words mean usually the same thing as English words, but we're not used to these words. I mean, it's the same thing, but we're not used to it. So to us, we have no idea. So one of the things that I try doing, and what Malware tries doing, is it tries naming things very confusingly, just to mess with our minds. So one of the things I do in order to try to keep my sanity is to simply rename things, to make it easier for me to understand, to remember, and to follow and make sense of them. So going back to this Tarokers and what's counterplot 01 equals IEX, Stevigsnigsbur. Well, we could just rename that variable. Literally just do a search and replace. Instead of $Tarokers, just set it to a variable called $URL. $, I don't know what IEX does, but I'll just set it to a variable called IEX. $, what was that? PW shell equals syswow, just because it's referencing PowerShell. It doesn't really matter what it is that I'm setting it to, but I'm just making it a little bit more human. So what we can now do is actually go through with just the two previous activities that I talked about. Calling Tessel 869 pretty much manually and doing those translations, and then renaming all these variables to something a little bit more intelligent or intelligible. So this is actually what I did. I literally just copy and pasted each line one by one, manually translated it, and then I just set some variables accordingly. Well, that looks a little bit more like code. It definitely looks codey-y. Any questions, thoughts? Okay. So one thing, again, I usually look at the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that kind of seems to present itself. This IEX here is interesting mainly because one of the things I look at is if something is referenced a lot. The more times something is referenced, it's probably kind of more important. So I see here this IEX, I set this variable equal to IEX, and then this variable seems to be referenced a number of times. And we know here, at the very top here, that translation that Tessel 869 did is it resulted in this IEX. I can tell you, I am not a PowerShell expert by any means. So I had to go call my friend, the Google. And I simply Googled Windows PowerShell IEX. And it says here, invoke expressions IEX and PowerShell are a common method of executing code. They allow for the evaluation of expressions and the execution of code that's stored in a variable. Threat actors often use them for their ability to launch both local and remote payloads. Well, that kind of seems relevant to all this malware-y stuff that we're doing. So I just went in and actually looked up the actual documentation for this IEX, invoke expression. And one of the things it talks about in this example is evaluate an expression. That's what that invoke expression does. And pretty much, let's say there is a PowerShell command called, get process. In PowerShell, you can issue that command, get process, hit enter, it's going to give you a list of processes. Or you can actually say, invoke expression, get process. Pretty much, you're kind of telling the computer, you're telling PowerShell, go do this command. So when you're in PowerShell, you can kind of do a command two different ways. You can just do the command, or you can say, invoke expression, the command. Does that make sense? So you're able to set whatever command you want as a string and say, go do this. So going back to our code here, we have this IEX here a number of times, and we know that translation is IEX. If you take a look at, let's say, this first one right here, it says IEX, again, forgive me, klesrubnup2 equals envwinder. This is basically saying, go do this, and go do this is klevruznusnup2 equals envwinder. Well, that's simply the same thing as saying klesrup equals envwinder. So you can actually get rid of all these IEXs. Because again, you're saying IEX, do this command. You can get rid of that and just do the command directly. So this is that code, which is getting rid of all the execute commands and executing them directly. Again, it's looking a lot more codey-y. I'm sorry. And what did I do here? Oh, and then what I did is, remember I talked about variables and words have meanings. All I did is this stuff now these are variables, klesrut and elsepla. All I did was apply the same thing. I said, I'm going to give it some reasonable variable names. So in here, I have $command, $command line, $winder. Again, it makes it a lot more readable, a lot more understandable. So now that we have, I don't know, to me, looks like fairly clean code, fairly straightforward. I mean, there's only around 25 lines of code here in this malware. This ain't rocket science. What I can tell you is this first part pretty much sets up things like the files, names, and locations. Again, it's just a handful of lines. The next section pretty much downloads the actual malware payload. And then the third section actually executes that malware payload. So we are less than a half an hour into this. And we just went from the gobbledygook to fairly straightforward code with very limited technical analysis whatsoever, just by applying these three things. Again, this is the same exact stuff. No technical analysis, no knowing assembly language or anything like that. Less than a half an hour we did this. I want to circle back a little bit. Take a look at our friend Tessel869 here, this thing that does the converting somehow. It converts from that gobbledygook to a proper text string. So using all of the previous techniques we went through, like keywords, renaming variables, it could actually be rewritten to clarify it. Instead of calling it Tessel869, we know it's converting this stuff. We'll call it, I don't know, convert. We know it's reading in data. The original function is called flit, right? Or the variable it's reading in the data in is flit. Why don't we just call it $ input? That makes it a little bit easier to be following. For those of you that ever programmed like a for loop, usually you do like for x equals 1, right? So we can get rid of this for mitochondrial, right? Which is hard to understand, and just say for x equals 1, pretty much as straightforward as that. If you take a look at it, just to analyze this code, and this is as in-depth as we're getting on the technical end, if we analyze this very simple function, it's pretty much reading in some gobbledygook or some text, and it's simply looping through. We have this for loop, and it's pretty much looping through and then incrementing. See, x plus equals 1 plus 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. That hasn't changed yet. So we're pretty much incrementing by 2. And then we're returning the result of that. So if we take a look on that top white line is one of the inputs of that gobbledygook. And in the case, now the bottom big white line is the index, what index number it is. When x is equal to 1, it's going to return that letter h, because that's the character in the string that we passed. But now when it loops through again, x is going to be equal to 3, right? It's incrementing by 2. So when x is equal to 3, it's going to return item number 3, which is a t. And then x is equal to 5, t, p, colon, slash. Anyone get the pattern? It's pretty much every other character. So, now what's interesting is when you take a look at this, and once it clicks, wait a minute, this whole tessel 869 is simply doing every other character. Once it clicks, you don't even need to look very hard, and actually, all of this text, you can kind of see through it, and you can see what the actual values are. Again, we're not doing anything complicated. These malware people aren't as smart as we kind of make them out to be. And pretty soon you can see through all the obfuscation and all of that confusion. So let's go a little bit deeper here. The code downloads the payload into a file called rooflick.san, whatever that is. Don't know, but that's what it's doing. I mentioned earlier, this part of the code downloads the actual malware. It's downloading into a file called rooflick.san. Guess what? We found rooflick.san. Oh yeah, is that it? Yeah. So we found rooflick.san, and this is it, or at least part of it. Gobbledygook again, right? Well, we can take into account the previous things that we talked about, right? We can, one of the things that that is relevant to programming languages is comments. Again, for those of you that have programmed, ever have your computer science teacher yell at you, you got to put good comments in, you got to comment your code. Comments are ignored by code, by the computer. Normally, people use comments to make it more readable, to make their code more readable. But there's nothing stopping bad guys leveraging comments to make the code unreadable. So in PowerShell, comments are identified using a hash or a pound sign. So if you take a look at all these lines here, all these lines are simply comments. Everything after that pound sign is simply a comment. So we can completely disregard it. We can do a simple search and replace and get rid of all of these comments. And then we ended up with something like this. So we can go from that junk to this. It's the same exact stuff as far as the computer is concerned, those same essential lines of code, and all we did was get rid of the comments. Looking at what's left here, any of this look familiar? Look at this function here, auto02. Well, that's interesting. There's this function right here at the top. And then, look, there's a whole bunch of stuff calling auto02. And what's it doing? It's passing in a whole bunch of gobbledygook. Huh. I told you, Most of these malware guys, when they do something and and it works once, they just keep on doing it. It's their MO. So we can go and do the same exact methods I talked before and plug these strings in, go to someone else's computer. If you have a friend you don't like very well, something like that, go to his computer, paste the code in there. Paste that auto02 in function and call it with all of these. And if we were to do that, boom, we get this translation. Seems a bit better. Seems more human-y. So all I did was paste the gobbledygook into the auto02 function, and these are the strings that got returned. We also found another file on the system that was a bit suspicious called hesslar.vbs. It was an interesting file. Now, it's a .vbs, meaning it's Visual Basic. So it's a different programming language than PowerShell. This is the contents of that file. So now, one little question. When is code not code? We talked about before comments. We talked about all this other stuff. One thing that people fail to appreciate is when is code not code? Code isn't code when it's simply not used. So we talked about hiding stuff and renaming stuff and things like that, the different ways to hide the obfuscated code. But there is nothing stopping somebody from writing actual proper code that will execute. But it does nothing, or there's no relevance, there's no bearing to it. Let me see here. This private const over blessedness equals 10892. I mean, yes, that's an actual command. The computer is actually going to run it. But if it's not used anywhere, it's completely pointless. It's worthless. So that's another way in which code isn't code. So there's nothing saying obfuscation needs to be in comments or unexecuted code. It could be in normal executed code. I think I have another page here. Here's another page of that same file. To the point of, there's even some points in this code that's desma something or what equals rtrim by some gobbledygook. So it's actually calling a function. It's doing something, doing some text manipulation. But again, it's not used anywhere. And it's a fairly simple thing to see, is this variable used anywhere else in the code? If it's not, you can delete it. It's not used. Also at the top, ooh, did I do that? All right. Also at the top here, it says for match equals 0 to ubound. This is actual code that's looping around doing some stuff. So it's actually executing, but it's not really used in the program. Again, it's just looping around, just wasting time pretty much, just to confuse us. So we can actually go and get rid of all that stuff. Oh, there's something else I was going to talk about. I talked about comments before, right? With the pound sign. In Visual Basic, a comment is identified by an REM, or a REM statement. A REM statement is just a comment. So again, we can apply all of this stuff and get rid of unused code, get rid of these comments, and we actually end up with something like this. This VG3 equals VG3 plus funct VG3 equals VG3 plus O on Tessel 869. And what this is basically doing is it's simply appending characters to a string. This VG string, it's building up this big long string. And if we take a look, some of the stuff may be a little familiar here. This function, Tessel 869, remember mitocoram, counterpla. This is actually the Visual Basic script that the user had downloaded, which created the registry key, stuck this in the registry key, which then ran and downloaded into rooflet.san. So we've actually come full circle here in terms of all of this malware. So just going to finish up here. So returning to the world of fossils. Again, feel free to take it. My wife will kill me if they're not all gone. Return to the world of fossils. Really, at first, the landscape, it seems barren. You look at that, it looks like a chaotic, random field of rocks. But once you've trained your eyes, once you know what you're looking for, everything changes. Those once hidden fossils emerge, not because you were lucky, but because they were there all along, waiting to be revealed. Just like with obfuscated malware, the veil will lift. I mean, what seemed indecipherable transforms into clarity. That once impossible task becomes second nature. The fossils, just like the malware, were always there. You just need to know where to look. Any question? Oh, thank you. Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? So I think this is important. A lot of times people will see that initial registry key, and again, they run away. They run away, either making the excuse, oh, this is nothing, or frankly, they're too scared of it and they don't want to admit it. And it's amazing how simple a lot of this stuff is. And it's going to help you, because if you see something in here, again, a lot of sysadmins, if they're reviewing logs or whatnot, they're going to see that and just kind of move on. But now, wait a minute, there could be something hidden in it that might make a big difference. All right, yes?
What did the code actually do? The malware?
Ransomware. It did, ransomware. It did really nasty. I'm still having a really, really hard time figuring out what it's doing. It's like doing literally low-level assembly language. What it was doing was really interesting, because the malware payload itself it's really interesting, because it was a combination, it was a binary file, but a certain amount of the binary file at the top was just text. And then after a certain point, it was actual executable code. And what the initial, the one with Tesla and all that stuff, the initial set of code I had in there, it's really interesting because it actually points to, like, it knows, okay, up to this character is normal text. It was actually a PowerShell script. So it actually went and it downloaded that malware, and then it split that malware, that payload, into two things: a text PowerShell thing, and then it pretty much jumped right to a certain part of that payload file and then executed it directly. And then, it sat resident in the computer in memory, changed a bunch of stuff, set auto start stuff to always keep it on, encrypted all the files, all that fun stuff. So, all right, I got you all out early today. So thank you all again, and I think you have one more set, right, of classes?
We have one more set
of sessions?
So we would like to thank Mark